We are joined on the phone today by authors Tom Beaujour and Richard Bienstock. We're talking about their new book, Nothin But a Good Time, The Uncensored History of the 80s Hard Rock Explosion. Hey guys, how you doing today?
Good, how are you?
I am excellent. You guys got a new book out, Nothin But a Good Time, The Uncensored History of the 80s Hard Rock Explosion. Can you tell the listeners a bit about the new book?
It's a history of sort of what people call glam metal or hair metal sort of movement that happened between 1981 roughly and 1991. So all the bands that you love or love to hate, like Motley Crue, Poison, Skid Row, Quiet Riot, Warrant, Vixen, it's all of those bands telling the story themselves in their own words. It's all quotes from the musicians themselves.
Excellent. Yeah, this is a big book. Definitely goes in depth with all the bands, in LA starting out and, right up through the last days when grunge kind of changed the course. How long did it take you guys to put this book together? I mean, a lot went into it, obviously.
We, I guess you could say we officially started on it in 20. And, from that point, I mean, I could say that there were years and years before that where we talked about the idea of doing, Tom and I, many years, the guitar world, and we were both sick. But once we finally got into it in 2017, there was a period where we were in sample chapters together to the book, and then sort of from there, taking a little breaking into it. But the first year or two was really just all about, it was about finding anyone and getting them to speak on the record and not really worrying so much about, well, let's focus in on this part of the book and talk to all them. We'll focus on that part of the book and talk to all those people. It was talk to everybody, get them, and however you can get them, and then just bank all of that. And then after about, I'd say probably about 2 years in is when we really sat down and started and thinking about, okay, this is going to go in this section, this is how we're going to do this section, and then filling it out with any additional people needed.
You've got just about everyone you could think of in the book, and all the interviews you guys compiled. I imagine there must be just, hours and hours of interviews. Maybe you could put out, a couple days worth of just the interviews out there for kind of like a compendium to the book.
Yeah, I think that, look, I mean, this book is almost 600 pages, and I think the amazing thing was realizing how much ended up on the cutting room floor. It seemed like there we would have put everything we could into that size of a manuscript, but there's actually it's to us and hopefully maybe to other people it reads as a very tight story. We couldn't even imagine having to cut anything out and still having told the story in the way that we want. And I think given how deep we went with a lot of these subjects, we could probably fill another book the same size with that we do have on tape.
Well, it's basically a who's who of people of that scene and around that time period, and a lot of them still around today making music. But is there anyone maybe you were hoping to speak with that you didn't get a chance to? I mean, there can't be too many that you weren't able to get for the book.
There were a couple people. Who we kind of went into it knowing that we probably wouldn't get, and we probably asked once and got no response. We knew going in that John Bon Jovi probably would not be interested in talking about this particular era of music. He doesn't seem to ever really want to talk about it. He managed to emerge from it pretty unscathed, and I think now is much more interested in sort of being seen as a peer of like a Bruce Springsteen or Bono or something like that. So we knew starting out that we probably weren't going to be able to approach him and say like, hey, do you want to do an in-depth interview about your 80s period? It just wasn't going to happen. So we, I think, sent one email and we knew there wouldn't be a response. And then the other person, because he speaks to nobody that we didn't expect to get and didn't, was Axl Rose. And although the thing is, we spoke to so many other people in Guns N' Roses and in the Guns N' Roses universe, from early on to producers, publicists, managers, et cetera, that you still get a really, really good picture of who Axl is. And we also spoke with enough people, who toured with Bon Jovi, worked with Bon Jovi, managed Bon Jovi, so his presence is felt as well.
Excellent. Again, we're on the phone today with Tom Beaujour and Richard Bienstock. We're talking about the new book, Nothin But a Good Time, The Uncensored History of the 80s Hard Rock Explosion. And you kind of mentioned, this time period, the music you love to hate, or some of these guys like John Bon Jovi or Axl maybe kind of, I don't know if they're kind of ashamed of that time period. Obviously, they made a lot of money, but, maybe shying away from that era. Why do you think that is? I mean, that stuff was huge at the time and so important. And, a lot of the guys that you mentioned that came out of it, they probably wouldn't know who they were if it hadn't been for the hair metal, as they say.
I think every artist responds to it differently, and I would, I wouldn't go so far that like a John Bon Jovi or an Axl Rose is ashamed associated with it, because I wouldn't venture to, they have never said as much. So, I mean, we can think that might be the case, but who really knows? I mean, it could be, Axl Rose in particular, someone who he just about the past that much anyway, whether you're talking about, the Sunset Strip or hair metal or whatever, like you're talking in that much. But even if he were to do interviews, you wouldn't expect him to go over the past that much. He's going to focus on the present. A guy like John Bon Jovi, he still does acknowledge that past and talk about it. But, for whatever reason, he has decided that his career works for him by, sort of place music in sort of a more modern, sort of place, or even like for this, like, rootsy or countryish or whatever you want to call it. But that has worked for him since this time. I think a lot of bonding to that era in the early 90s where this music was no longer acceptable. And like for a guy like Bon Jovi, he was able to transcend that moment by moving into a different genre rather than double down. And so that worked for him. And so there's really no reason for him to go off of that path at this point.
This was, again, that's the thing, is for a lot of these people in these bands, the 90s was a very, very bad time. Like their careers and the music that they had so much success with was basically canceled. So there really was now we look and it seems all rosy because it's sort of become the new classic rock, and these bands are out playing and they're playing festivals and they can still fill stadiums. There was a rough decade there. So I think, a lot of people associated with this are still smarting a little bit from being sort of told, not overnight, but kind of like that what they had done was dumb and sexist and no longer cool. And I think it left a lot of them with some pretty deep scars. So I think if they might not be ashamed of what they did, but I think they're a little bit gun shy or of people coming at them and being dismissive of their music or their art or their legacy. And it was really important for us doing this book to let it be known very quickly, and it sort of spread through the industry and through the sort of fabric of all these people quickly that we were completely fans of this music and knew our stuff and not out to ask people questions that were going to sort of make them look dumb or belittle their accomplishments. I think that some of the people involved with this still expect that that's what they're going to get from the press.
Sure. And it seems like, especially at the time, maybe a lot of the craziness of the bands and, the images and, a lot of that stuff might have turned some people off. But, when you strip a lot of that stuff away, a lot of those songs were pretty solid. I think they could have worked in a lot of different genres, minus the leather and the crazy hair and everything that went along with it.
Yeah, we talk about this in the book, and some of the artists do as well, is this music has really become like the new classic rock. And that's not some sort of hyperbolic statement. This music, look, when we all grew up on classic rock radio in the 80s and 90s, like that music was 20, 30 years old. This music is 30, 40 years old, and it's taking that place, and people respond to it in that way, whether it's through nostalgia for when they were children, just like with, earlier eras of classic rock, or if it's new, younger fans that want to sort of experience what that was like. And like, if you go to a Poison show or something like that and you hear a song like Nothing But a Good Time, I mean, it's that same sort of like vibe, that sort of top down, feel good, everybody sing along thing that like, I don't know, eras ago, like here or still today, like hearing like a Boston song or something like that does or a Van Halen song when it comes on the radio. It's like it's filling that same spot for people, and that is because of the songwriting. Like some of these songs are really genuinely great, tight pop songs, and that stands the test of time.
No, we were talking to one of the guys who books a lot of these bands now, and some of the bands will have one original member, two original members, some have no original members. And, what he said, though, which was really to what you're saying, he's like, some of the fans don't even mind that much how many original members, because it is about the song. They want to hear the songs. And that's what transcends, that's what survives every artist, like even beyond when these people are able to tour, those songs they have proven that they will stand the test of time.
And when it comes to the songs, can you talk a bit about the importance of the ballad? I mean, and why, appealing to the female audience was so important? Because I think that's where a lot of the fans came in back then. And, even nowadays with the resurgence of it and people still going out to see these bands, a lot of moms, I think, that were fans back in the day when they first came around.
The ballads were an incredibly important part of the fabric. I mean, for some bands, they were just doing it. They were doing it because the bands that they liked had ballads. For example, they liked "Dream On" by Aerosmith. They liked "Stairway to Heaven." They liked all of their favorite bands had quieter songs. And then what it became was this, and probably one of the things that people also, when they're poking holes at this music or poking holes in this music, it became this massive marketing thing where, the first two songs were rockers to prove to the guys that you were tough. And then the third song was the ballad that pushed you, into the mainstream if you were lucky. And if you really got lucky and it became a hit and got on AM radio, it opened up an entirely new audience, much of it this female audience who weren't really interested in guitar heroes or like power riffs or anything like that. And so that was the thing that was going to push your album from selling maybe 1 million or 2 million to 5 million. CeCe DeVille once said, your first two singles, you buy your car; your ballad, you buy a house. And that was how it worked, because it just unlocked this massive audience.
And it seems, at that time with MTV in the 80s as well, those two kind of went hand in hand, I think, because of the, the hairstyles and the outrageous costumes and all that stuff. It probably wouldn't have been, as big without MTV, I think, as well.
No, it wouldn't have. And, this music isn't necessarily unique in that respect. A lot of music that was big in the 80s would not have worked in the same way without MTV. The difference with this music is just the timing was really spectacular, because one of the things that we've talked about a lot is the fact that you have these bands in the late 70s and the early 80s that are really toiling for, in a lot of ways, in obscurity, at least mainstream obscurity, whether it's Twisted Sister on the East Coast, Quiet Riot on the West Coast. Like, these are bands that have been together for a decade before they break. But when MTV comes into the picture and they do break, and those are among the first two bands that break, I mean, Quiet Riot is really the one that does it with Come On Feel the Noise, that video. To everybody at home watching on TV, it's like this hot new thing, and oh my God, and it's like perfectly tailor-made for MTV. But the reality is Quiet Riot has been doing this for 10 years, and they've been doing it exactly like this, about getting up on stage, putting on an amazing show, looking great, acting kind of wild, big hair, everything. So, that's what they've done day in and day out, playing in these tiny clubs. And so when something like MTV comes along, like, they don't have to really rethink what they do. And actually, a lot of bands that do wind up making them on MTV actually do have to rethink what they do and tailor it for this new era. But for these bands, all you have to do is put a camera on them and shoot them on a stage doing what they have been doing every night for years. And it's, and it's magic. Like, it's exactly what is required.
And it really turns them into, in a way that now that there's so many different places to get your media, it's hard to remember. Like MTV, every kid watched it. And so these musicians became not only successful, but celebrities. They couldn't go out, like they were as famous as anybody gets. The two brothers in Nelson, Gunnar and Matt, if they went to if they each went individually to the mall after they were successful, it would be okay. But if they went together, suddenly there was actually a riot, because it created this Beatlemania. These people were, famous. They were on TV every hour. So it was huge in breaking these bands and making them sort of like household names.
Yeah, and there definitely were a lot of them throughout the 80s, but then eventually it got to be a bit silly, I think, and kind of a parody of itself. And, everyone kind of points to, the changing trends and Nirvana kind of putting an end to these kind of bands. Do you think that's fair, 100% that it was that, or do you think it would have been inevitable that these bands kind of would have went away after a while?
I think it's inevitable. The way any genre, or not even just genre, like any sort of cultural movement, subsudes over time. But I think what's different here, the whole grunge thing in Nirvana, like it definitely, it hastens it, and it also makes it, it really sort of cuts it off, where it's just like you're on one side or the other. But this music had a really good run by that point. If you're talking about like Quiet Riot hitting number one in 1983, and now it's 1991, 1992. That's a really good run to be as dominant as this music was. So yeah, it probably would have faded out anyway. I don't know that it would have faded out in the same way, where like you couldn't, look like these guys, sound like these guys, or, really to the point, be one of these guys and succeed at all, or even really exist in the mainstream world. These guys were really just cut off at the knees, and that was not fair, and it was unfortunate, and it really damaged a lot of them for a lot of years. They've all sort of come out of it, and actually most of the bands are doing great again. But, the way that happened, I think, was unlike the way any other sort of musical movement or genre came to an end.
And it extended beyond the musicians. That was what was so unique about it as well. Like all of the major producers of the era, Bo Hill, Michael Wagner, they were not hired anymore. Immediately, suddenly they were tainted. The A&R guys who had signed the sort of the glam metal bands or the bands from this movement, the newer alternative bands wouldn't sign with them because they didn't want to be associated with them. It was in a radio-related story, there's a story in our book about how Cinderella is on tour in 93 or 94, and they're going to go through Seattle. And they're going through Seattle, and they just want to buy advertising time on the local rock station to advertise their show. And the rock station tells them, sorry, we really can't take your money. We don't want your name on our station. So the hostility was something, it was even, I think, worse than sort of the disco sucks thing. It was the hostility towards these bands when it was over, whether it was Nirvana or whether they had played out their, role, was something that we haven't seen again. It was bizarre and, yes, totally, I think, unjustified.
Well, now enough time has passed where, a lot of things, not just that kind of music, but just the 80s, I guess, in general, really having a resurgence. And, a lot of these bands are still out there now and, maybe more popular now than they were, back then towards the end of the decade. But again, this is a great time for the book. Nothing But a Good Time is just out now, I know. But is there anything else maybe you guys are working on or other projects maybe we should be looking out for?
If we're lucky and everything goes as planned, there should be a documentary series based on the book sometime in the near future that seems to be happening. So I don't hold me to it if we run into each other in an elevator one day, but it seems that is going to be happening.
Awesome.
So that would be fun.
Yeah, definitely. Looking forward to that if it happens. You know, as we mentioned early in the interview here, it's a lot of people that have been involved with this book and the interviews that you guys have gotten. So either way, the book is great, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time out with me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
And again, that was Tom Beaujour and Richard Bienstock, the authors of the new book, Nothin But a Good Time, The Uncensored History of the 80s Hard Rock Explosion, and that's available now.